Again, hi, thanks for all showing up. Getting squared away here. Alrighty, I see we got initial slides so uploaded. Let me reschedule here. Bink, bink, bink. I'll approve them. Let me see if they show up. Dink, more tools. Upload, manage slides. Awesome. So they're there. Can I see the slides now? Share the slides. Solving the treasure. Woohoo!
I think they're all there.
Awesome. Let's do it. All right. Hey, welcome to a TLS interim session. Let me get these slides back up so you can see the note well. Confirm my selection. Again, this session is being recorded for posterity's sake. I guess the most important thing is we do need somebody to volunteer to take notes. It's kind of hard to present and moderate, etc. while we're doing this. Is there somebody that's willing to take notes in the note-taking tool there?
I could take notes for like the first half, but I'm gonna have conflicts later.
Fair enough. That's awesome. If you and Brendan can split it, that'd be awesome. Thank you very much. And if anybody else, if you want to log in there and make sure that they write down what you're saying, that's also helpful. But let's get to it. All right. So this is the note well. This is an IETF official meeting. The reminders. Oh wow. Brendan, I think you've got to log in. If that's, let me see.
Yeah, you have to be logged into Data Tracker.
Yeah. Wait a minute. We'll get going. We'll get that figured out. Note well, this is the policies and procedures. Again, this is an official meeting, so we're going to follow the rules. We got a bunch of BCPs about the standards process. There's also a link there to the working group process. We have some anti-harassment procedures, code of conduct, copyright and patents and participation. The quick way to summarize this, if you know something, say something about IPR. And the next slide, I will do a little bit more about how to, operate in the meetings. Basically, this is a summary about how we're trying to, make sure we follow our code of conduct and do the things right to make sure that we have a pleasant meeting. You don't have to like people's ideas, but you do have to treat them with respect. And we're going to try to adhere to that. If not, we have things that we can pull. And if you feel like you've ever been not getting the fair shake, you can tell us, ADs, OBUDS person, other people on the list. Feel free to say something, and we will try to get things corrected as best we can. Next. All right, here's our agenda. Let me pull up my little notes. So this basically is a kind of a one topic kind of interim that we're going to have, mostly about the trust tussle, as it's been called, and whether or not it is a trust tussle, as you'll see from the presentations. I guess basically the key point here is that this has been a little bit contentious on list, and we're going to try to keep it try to keep the heat down as much as possible. Again, just remember, you don't have to like the people's ideas, but we do kind of have to all get along well enough to keep working together. We are recording the session, so keep that in mind. Again, there have been a couple of drafts that have been floated with some potential solutions. We are trying specifically to not talk about those today. So we're really trying to focus just on the problem statement and trying to agree to it. In some respects, you could think of this as kind of like a mini BOF. Like, do we understand the thing that we're trying to solve, and then go trying to look for solutions. If that'll help you kind of frame it in your minds, that would help. I will note that we did schedule for 3 hours. Right now, we've only got an agenda that's maybe an hour and a half. I will note that I saw Dennis put up a pretty thick deck, so we're definitely going to have some time management being applied to some of the presentations. So I just want to say that while we do have 3 hours scheduled, the agenda need not fill that time if we don't. And also, if we like super rat hole and if we super rat hole and get stuck and we're not really going very well, we're going to call it a day, and maybe we can have another specific meeting about this later. We're just trying to make sure we can kind of like keep it positive and moving forward, and moving forward in a sense of either we're deciding whether we can get to an agreement on the problem statement or not, and if not, then we stop. If we can get agreement, then we go forward. What else? I guess the other thing I want to say is, as you'll note, I did agree, or we enlisted Chris Wood to kind of act as a little bit of an intermediary to provide some of the informal background and high-level problem statement. And I want to thank him for jumping in the middle to allowing us chairs to kind of be impartial and go from there. So we'll start from that. I do know that Chris has a dinner appointment in like 2.5 hours, so that might be a good kind of like total upper limit, but we'll go from there. And I guess that's what we're going to do. So yeah, fair enough. Thanks, Chris. Where do I say yes?
I'm not sure. Oh,
Did they go? Revoke audio? Yep. Alrighty. Maybe try again.
okay, hold on. There we go.
Yeah.
That should be working.
I see it. I see it.
Great. All right. Yeah. So as Sean said, I guess the hope here is to sort of describe a general problem statement that hopefully we can or cannot agree upon based on the contents of the mailing list, based on discussions we've had with proponents of the draft and other people as well. This is kind of coined the trust tussle, for lack of a better name. I really don't care what you call it. But the idea is that this is just about the general problem space, not specifically about any of the solutions. So I guess the order of operations is here. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this is, and then we're going to have 2 follow-up presentations, one talking sort of in favor of it, and then one sort of talking against it, and then hopefully have time for the working group to discuss at the end of that. So I'm going to I guess jump in. Hopefully none of this is like too surprising. So taking many steps back, imagine or envision your typical TLS client connection. Client sends a client hello to the server with a bunch of stuff in it. Server replies with the server hello, a bunch of stuff, and then handshake completes, and they start sending application data back and forth. Everything is all good and well. One of the properties of the handshake is that the client's able to authenticate the server, and typically how this is done is by the server presenting a certificate to the client that the client can verify. And the certificate that's presented is typically one that's issued from a certificate authority that the client happens to trust. Again, hopefully nothing shocking. And the primary goals of this sort of system that enables connections to succeed and servers to provide some sort of service capability to their clients is first and foremost availability. We'd like it such that servers are able to like provide their service to all clients despite which particular CAs they happen to trust. But on the flip side, we also like it that the system provides some measure of security so that clients only trust legitimately issued certificates and not ones that are controlled by the attacker. I guess the implication being that clients should not trust untrustworthy CAs. And these are two sort of orthogonal goals, but they interact in very interesting ways in the system. In particular, if you look at or if you like sort of generalize like what particular CAs a client happens to trust. So typically in practice, a client doesn't trust just one CA, it trusts other CAs as well. And this like set of certificate authorities that the client trusts is like the trustor. Um, and it would be really nice, ideally, if like all clients in the world had the same exact trustor. Then servers could just get a certificate issued from one of the CAs in this trustor and provide it to any client connection, and presumably it would verify, because all clients, by definition or by assumption rather, trusts the certificates or the certificate authorities in this trustor. But more often than not, the clients have different trustors. So client A will have like its own version of a trustor, and client B will have its own version as well. Um, and it's not the case that every single trustor happens to be the same. So it's not the case that all these different trustors have the same exact sets of certificate authorities in them. I guess a more realistic way to look at this picture is that there are different trustors and there are different CAs in each of them. So if you're a certificate, getting a connection from a random client, you need to prevent certificate in order to like actually let the client authenticate the connection and proceed. Um, and if you're sort of an advanced or like more competent certificate or server rather, you might look at the client and be like, oh, well, I recognize this particular client. I maybe from its client hello fingerprint. And I know like it has these particular certificate authorities in its trustor based on whatever version you happen to associate with that fingerprint, and I'll present a particular certificate based on that particular client fingerprint. And so some server deployments are configured with multiple certificates in this way to support this sort of arrangement. But this is not true of every certificate or every server rather. Some servers just are configured with a single certificate. And for reasons of like maximal interoperability, they do so, or they choose their certificate from sort of the intersection of all these trustors. And this sort of inherently presents or creates some sort of pressure for clients to have a maximal or like a wide intersection, or not small intersection, so that you can get a certificate issued and it covers sort of the most number of clients. But there's also pressures in the opposite direction, for trustors to sort of diverge, and to not be the same. So imagine you had a trustor or 4 trustors A, B, C, D with these certificate authorities in them, and you might want to add one. For example, you might want to add a CA to this trustor, or D, and specifically might want to add one to its trustor. It would do so, or in doing so, it would diverge a little bit from the other trustors, therefore like narrowing the intersection. You might also remove CAs, like say D might remove CA4 from its list, whereas the other ones might keep it. But beyond the sort of like the actual acts themselves of adding and removing and changing things, there's also other pressures that sort of influence diversity. So for example, it's not the case that clients are required to agree upon what's in their trustor. In fact, they're sort of empowered to make these decisions about the contents of the trustor independently. And different client implementations might have different requirements for what goes in their trustor. So for example, they might have like different requirements for whether or not the certificates that are issued from a CA are like included in CT or what have you, whatever. Like it doesn't matter, or some people might say it does matter, but in my mental model, it doesn't really matter that much. I guess at the end of the day, they're allowed to make decisions independently. And one way which this manifests is a client might make more restrictive trust decisions. So for example, this might like um, uh, uh, come about in practice as like a form of pinning. So for example, like a client may choose to only trust a subset of some particular certificate authorities or intermediary certificates or whatever, because it's a mobile application and it has a more like higher security posture or whatever. I'm not going to comment on the goodness or badness of pinning, but sometimes this happens in practice. And even in the happy case where everyone does sort of agree on the contents of the the trust stores, like what certificate authorities are generally trustworthy or which ones are not. The rate at which changes to their trust stores are rolled out can change in practice or differ in practice. So, for example, one client may have the ability to dynamically update their trust store, other clients cannot, although in practice today, like most clients can do so. Um, and but even if they can do so, they might update at different rates. So, for example, one client might immediately get their updates, allowing them to authenticate servers and with the new changes affected, whereas others might take some time. So the tussle, as best as I can, or as we can sort of possibly try to sharpen it, narrow it to a succinct, not complicated, not overly verbose sentence. It's kind of described as such. So in this system, how do you avoid client trust conflicts by enabling servers to reliably and efficiently support clients with diverse trust anchor lists in large PKIs where the existing mechanisms that we have available to us, such as certificate authorities, don't work? In the certificate authorities extension, if you were to try to apply that to the web PKI, just it is far too big to list every single possible CA on it. And thinking about whether or not this is a problem we're solving, there's some additional considerations that have been raised, that have been discussed. So, for example, the extent and duration of divergence when it does happen. Is it really that big of a deal? Does it actually matter that things, there's a blip in divergence and then maybe things flip back to normal, or sort of I'm gonna call it the steady state is the steady state where there's no changes happening in any particular different client's implementation of their trust store. Is that are we sort of comfortable living in that world, and sort of living with the infrequent or the pain that is associated with any particular change? I guess as a sort of correlate to that, it are the sort of the forces of divergence, when things are push client implementations in opposite directions, um, are they so few and far between that the current distribution of operational pain seems like the best outcome? In other words, are we sort of okay that when things do need to change, it's a little bit painful for some server operators or some server deployments, and we don't really have a good answer to that, um, uh, or are we not okay with that? Um, as has also been discussed in the list, sort of, in the orbit of the space is the question of how we sort of begin the transition to a post-quantum PKI. And it might be the case, for example, that we don't care about this general problem, solving this, this tussle wherein there's general client diversity, and we only specifically care about solving this PQ PKI problem. Might we want to focus on rather specifically on that rather than the generic thing? And then because we're solving this particular problem is asking for a system to change, it's important to consider what are the possible downstream effects of this tussle, and a number of them have been raised and discussed on the list, and I assume they will be discussed in the follow-up presentations as well. So I'm gonna stop there because I feel like if I talk any more about sort of the problem itself, the tussle, it's, I guess, difficult to do so without sort of casting a bias in any one particular direction, and sort of the pros and cons of the system as it is or as it could be, I assume will be discussed by the follow-up presentations. So I guess I'll take clarifying questions if there are some, but in reality, I think we should probably flip over to the
I do think Stephen Farrell has one.
shoot. Shoot.
I put this in the chat, Chris, but I don't know if you were looking at it. So basically, it's a clarifying question. Could be asked two ways. One is, I think what you described covers Web PKI very well. Was it intended to also cover the general TLS that's not Web PKI? And perhaps that means that there's a consideration there on the missing from this slide that to what extent is this Web PKI stuff tussle, or does it affect PKI or TLS PKI more broadly?
I think this is mainly oriented around largest PKI, so that would include the Web PKI, I guess. Though I don't see any particular reason why it needs to be restrictive in that way. The larger PKI problem is certainly the more interesting one, at least in my view. Watson?
So one thing I think you touched on in these slides, some of the proposals have not just been about negotiating which CAs, but also negotiating features in the PKI. Like, I need SCTs, I want my certs maximum this lifetime, which you can, of course, associate with the CA.
That's true. Yeah, I don't really know what to say about that other than yes, this is a particular property of some of the implementations or some of the solutions rather. But the sort of ignoring that, I guess, for the purposes of this particular problem statement.
So, Chris, one question: who was going to go next? I wasn't sure whether it was the proponents or the people who don't think it's a problem.
I believe the trust expressions, trust anchor indicators, proponents will go next, but
Okay.
I don't think it matters.
Yeah, fair
If
enough.
you want to toss a coin.
Yeah, well, that's what I was trying to figure out, if you guys already tossed a coin or not. So we're happy to have that crew show up. The slides are there. You can present. Just kind of come online and join. If you've not used Meet Echo before, I can press the buttons for you. Just let me know what you guys want to do. All right, Bob.
David, I think you're going to drive the slides.
Yeah.
I believe it's the case that they're all three going to speak. Just a single person is going to drive.
Yeah, we can have multiple people.
That works.
Rolling. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I'm going to pipe down.
All right. Hopefully I did that correctly, but we'll see.
Yeah, look,
I saw two, but if one showed up, so long as you didn't upload two different sets of slides and I didn't approve them, which I didn't, so we should be good.
All right, so this is our interim. Next slide. I'd like to just thank Chris for presenting the problem statement. To start off, we'll just sort of outline what we think are the answers to some of the considerations Chris presented at the end towards our desire to solve this problem. We're going to show you how divergence in trust stores exists today, and we're going to give you some examples that we've seen of the difficulties that we've encountered due to a lack of a solution to this problem. So we do think that it does cause widespread pain, and this is a problem we want to consider solving. We do think that this pain is increasing over time. Many servers have a long tail of 10 to 15-year-old must-support clients, and this gets larger every year. When the web was young, we had relatively few browsers and essentially one mostly convergent trust store that didn't change very often. We now have multiple root programs for major browsers. We have browser forks, and we have many, many non-browser users of the public web PKI, all of which are using differing trust stores of differing vintages. And this is challenging. The long tail gets longer by the year. New clients are arriving faster than old ones fall off. It's not just your browser, it's your TV, your printer, your thermostat, your phone, your hot tub, your cat box. They all need to hit public web services. Those are just the ones I have in my house. We do believe this is an important and critical thing for a PQ transition as we are attempting to envision it, but it's not the primary motivating factor behind our desire to find a solution for this problem. We believe the problems as they sit today make it worth solving this on its own. And we're going to give some motivating examples about this. But first, we're going to recap the relevant background of TLS and client trust. So I'll just go back over to David.
All right, so let's make sure we're all on the same page as to why we even have this system. The point of the PKI, at least used in TLS, is to bridge between what the application protocol needs. We're talking to, for instance, example.com based on the URL and HTTPS client, or other systems might care about logos or other names. But at the end of the day, the application wants to authenticate some name, but the cryptography that we have only authenticates some public key pair. And so we need to bridge this somehow. And that is what the PKI is for. How do we do this? Well, the CAs issue certificates, which are signed name key pairs. The certificate tells you that TLS key 1234 is authoritative for example.com. Then the clients curate list of CAs, which are trusted to only sign correct name key pairs. And so in curating these lists, we need to satisfy two core and slightly opposing goals. First, things should work. The client needs to accept the correct name key pairs, which means that the client needs to trust enough CAs that authoritative servers can obtain and present a valid certificate, because the point of the authoritative server is to convince, the authoritative server's goal is to convince the client to accept its correct name key pair. But at the same time, we have a security requirement. The client cannot accept incorrect key pairs. If it does, then if the client accepts an attacker's key instead of the authoritative server's key, then this client is now at risk of TLS interception, which means that the client cannot trust an untrustworthy CA that is at risk of signing things incorrectly. So specifically, when we think about TLS interception, if a CA issues an incorrect name key pair, then what happens is the attacker can break the connection and then swap out the certificate with its own. And now the client goes, oh, okay, I guess this other key is actually authoritative for the TLS for example.com. And now the attacker can intercept the connection, surveil the contents, manipulate it, or do whatever else. The only way to mitigate this attack is that the client cannot trust untrustworthy CAs. If the client does not trust it, then the bad certificate will not be sufficient proof for the client, and then the client will not believe that the attacker's key is authoritative. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters in this system is which name key pairs that the client accepts. And so when we think about interception, the CA used by authoritative server does not matter for interception. If the certificate contains the correct key, the attacker still needs to replace it with intercepting. It doesn't matter who signed it, because if the key pair is correct, then that certificate is not useful for the attacker. Everything in this PKI centers on what the client accepts. And so with that background, we have our little trust tussle. Over time and across clients, PKIs face pressures that cause towards client trust anchor diversity. We'll talk about those pressures in a bit. And a single server, that means we'll need to support a wide range of clients that have different preferences, possibly due to different age or other different needs. And if the server is constrained to send only one certificate and then cannot support all of its clients simultaneously, then something needs to get sacrificed. If we sacrifice user security, then clients need to trust CAs that they do not deem trustworthy, and that puts users at risk. Remember, when we talk about compatibility pressures, those pressures only ever push towards adding CAs and thus increasing user risk. There are never compatibility pressures to removing a CA. Removal is a security goal, removal is done for security. Alternatively, we can sacrifice availability. The server will be forced to break more unusual niche clients, even though that the users behind those clients might still matter to the server operator. The server operator may eventually de-support those clients because they're older or too expensive to support, but ideally that happens on the server operator schedule, not in response to a security incident. And sometimes we just need to sacrifice both. Some clients will end up trusting CAs that they don't want to trust, and other clients will end up getting dropped by the servers because they can't be made to fit in this intersection. And given that these two are the core goals of our system, this is not a good situation. And so our goal here is to avoid this conflict by making so that servers can reliably and efficiently support clients with diverse trust anchor lists. And in particular, we're focused on the larger PKIs because TLS has already defined a solution for this exact problem with smaller PKIs. It's actually widely deployed for client certs and dates to at least SSL 3, if not SSL 2. We're here because we want to bring these benefits to existing big PKIs and not just the clients that either have a small PKI or have moved to one. And now I'll hand it over to Devin, who will talk a bit about the various scenarios that lead to client diversity.
Hey, everyone.
This is Devin. I'm going to take some time to discuss some examples that were strong motivators for us wanting to wade into this space in the first place. I know there's a lot of expertise in this space assembled here today, and I'm actually really excited to hear other people share their experiences and their priorities. But I'm going to focus on my experiences from the last decade or so. Next slide. Actually, before jumping into concrete examples, I wanted to share a blurb from a retrospective that we had written almost a decade ago about certificate changes that Google has faced. Back in 2015, it was written, Google certs have always been, changes to Google certs have always been painful just simply because there's no negotiation about certificates the way there are other parameters in TLS, for example. At the time, and again, this was 2015, we noted that certificate changes were actually getting more painful over time. There was an explosion of operating systems and devices and clients of not just sort of like browser flavored clients, but all things that must be supported. The support matrix had actually significantly increased. Whereas in 2015, and then what we've observed in the time since then is basically that in many ways, this has actually gotten more difficult, not less. And this is speaking from the perspective of Google needing to make changes, PI changes. We are both a CA, we have a lot of clients out there in the world, and we are a major server operator. Next slide. Okay, so to start with a concrete example, I want to just talk about the 2017 distrust of the semantic PKI. While there had been major failures in the PKI before this, the scope and impact of this distrust were absolutely unprecedented at the time. The short summary of what happened is the domain validation of all certs from a CA were called into question. And the scale and nature of the underlying incidents, there's actually a lot of incidents that culminated in this, required prompt distrust. We wanted to distrust this as quickly as possible to protect our users. But one of the first frictions that we had was coordinating this distrust across relying party browsers and operating systems actually introduced significant months-long delays in this process. And during that time, users were exposed to the risk of a CA that would have otherwise been distrusted, but had not yet been. Now, a lot of the details of distrust don't actually get shared publicly. But one of the biggest obstacles that we had to deal with was the breakage caused by sites' needs to support clients whose trust scores had now fully diverged. And I don't just mean going back to Chris's diagram where there's one CA difference in these. I'm talking about a Venn diagram where there is no overlap. Impacted websites needed to support clients with constrained trust stores, a bunch of clients that weren't actually doing this distrust. And it was the case that there was no other CA on the planet that could issue a certificate trusted by all supported clients for many servers. In this situation, the choice put in front of servers was deprecate some clients. This isn't actually always possible. Some servers need to serve like citizens of a country, for example, or they have a prohibitive amount of revenue stream lost by deprecating clients. So there's always a cost associated with this. Now, as a result of this, several major sites, we're talking like top 100 domains, were actually forced to re-architect their service to accommodate client divergence between, for example, set-top boxes that had a contractual need to be supported, but did not have a mechanism for altering their trust. Okay, next slide. Now, moving on to certificate transparency, specifically the policy aspect of this. A primary goal of CT deployment was to not force certificate reissuance when isolated log incidents occurred. There was a strong desire to have CT enforcement be resilient and robust to individual failures, and not just for one user agent, but across all user agents that participated in the CT ecosystem. Despite this, at the time, the ecosystem was very young and immature, and to ensure that we had reliable transparency, Chrome initially required one SCT, the signed certificate timestamp, come from a Google-operated log, as well as additional SCTs from non-Google logs. If additional clients entered the ecosystem that wanted to do this exact same policy, saying this is good enough for Google, it's good enough for us, but they wanted to say, just hypothetically, Safari says I have an Apple log, Edge says I have a Microsoft log, et cetera, this prohibitively embrittles the entire ecosystem because you'll have a certificate with, say, 5 SCTs. Each one of them is a critical load-bearing SCT for that certificate to continue to operate. This was painful enough when SCTs are 60, the signatures on SCTs are like 60 bytes from EC. This gets prohibitive in a system where we have to even entertain PQ certificates. Additionally, clients needed to make the same set of decisions on the same set of logs on roughly the same set of timelines. There could be fuzziness on the sides, but there was this very strong pressure because any log that wasn't recognized by all CT enforcing clients, there was no reason to log to them to satisfy these policies. It was just sort of it was just wasted bytes, or it was just an increased brittleness in the authentication. As a result of this, subsequent CT enforcing clients were forced to do a policy where they say, okay, I'm not going to say you need a Google SCT, but I want one SCT from one operator and one SCT from another operator. Log operators, these are. Somewhat interestingly, around 2016, there was a case where one widely trusted CA secretly acquired another widely trusted CA. Both of these CAs operated CT logs that were considered operationally distinct from one another. This gave this combined organization the ability to completely circumvent CT enforcement for clients with a looser policy. This is deeply, deeply undesirable facet of this ecosystem. And I wanted to highlight that the reason that the clients were in this state was because of the inability to support all things in an efficient manner. Eventually, Chrome itself was pressured to adopt a looser policy because, in part, to remove the CT ecosystem centralization on Google. Like, we didn't want to be a critical dependency in this ecosystem. Other people also didn't want us to be a critical member of the ecosystem. Next slide. Now, additionally on CT, there's something that I'm referring to as the shared fate problem. In 2019, Google tried to turn down a set of CT logs that was the original ones. This code base served us well for a while, but had eventually was realized that it had scaling and some operational challenges for log operators. So the code base was deprecated and a new one was written. These new logs were cheaper, more reliable, and they had been operated for many years by this point in time. And we had decided it's finally time to get rid of these old ones. It's expensive to operate. The ecosystem is being better served by new logs. Now, what happened at the time was there were certain Apple operating system clients that were constrained to trust these specific logs. These clients were still widely supported and did not have a way to update their log list dynamically. And so, because servers didn't have the ability to differentiate what they could serve to these old clients and versus new ones that were sort of on this sort of divergent like SCT policy implementation, the end result was that these logs ended up having to remain online and be trusted despite the risks and the cost of operating and the risks that these things would have a significant operational issue and cause a major incident for the ecosystem. And similarly, there was a situation in which, unknown to the maintainers of CT and the CT community at broad, a widely deployed mobile networking library began enforcing CT and was distributed to a lot of mobile applications. This library had a hard-coded dependency on the log list. And when we made a schema change to our log list, and now a log list is a representation of Chrome's policy. It's the same thing as like a trust store. These are independent decisions that we make accounting for the consequences to us and our dependencies. We had no idea that this was going to cause any problems, and it broke apps on this change. And somewhat famously, I believe, it took down McDonald's online mobile ordering for some period of time. So that was one of the consequences there. Next slide. Now, I wanted to touch about more, I think I'm two slide, I think there we go. Okay. Now I want to talk more recently about more recent divergences. I think a lot of these might be found more compelling. In 2022, a major large-scale must-support root program for major TLS clients has completely stopped accepting new CA operators. This has pretty profound implications for the Web PKI. New modern CA operators cannot actually stand up their service and independently issue trusted certificates that can be used in a plurality of TLS clients. It forces them to actually reach out to a competitor and pay their competitor money for a cross sign. And these cross signs are usually accompanied with contracts that dictate client base, certain practices, and these things are very opaque and are not open to the public, because these are sort of closed room agreements between these. As a result, this centralizes a lot of power in existing CAs and functionally serves to ossify the set of CAs who can make decisions about how certificates can be issued on the web. And in turn, this reduces pressure for CAs to improve and modernize. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that there are no CAs that are improving and modernizing. That is absolutely not the case. But in an ecosystem where new modern entrants can't enter, it reduces the motivation and the investment needed to keep up with these new clients, because they just simply can't compete by virtue of this property. In 2022, we launched the Chrome root program and its accompanied certificate verifier. If at the time existing root programs had converged sufficiently to meet our user needs, we probably wouldn't have undertaken the effort to stand up our own. This is a significant effort and comes at a significant cost, but we felt, looking at the landscape, that this was necessary to serve the best interests of our users. We inherited a set of CAs from existing root programs out of, if you've sort of going back to an earlier comment that Chris made, the compatibility pressure here. We needed to start with something. We bootstrapped with a set of CAs that had been vetted by some other root program and sort of gave us a place to start from. A consequence of this is that the Chrome root program has had to distrust many CAs that, come to find out, would have never met the bar for inclusion. We're talking things like root key generation called into question, large gaps in audits, times in which these sensitive keys have no visibility into their operation, as we have tried to ratchet over the years to require stricter and stricter operational requirements of CAs. Since about 2023, this is kind of fuzzy, the CA incident response expectations have begun to diverge. And this is not a necessarily fully causal relationship to distrust, but is the precursor to a point where if a CA is not meeting one root program's expectations, it may in fact contribute towards a trust decision down the road. Now, what's happened here is that the sort of root programs from which these CAs were inherited have changed or relaxed their enforcement of policies in a way that not all root programs may necessarily agree with. And if you've followed CA incident space closely over time, you may have seen that there have been some particularly egregious examples of CA incident response quality decreasing. Again, caveat, not all incident responses have decreased, but we have seen some, given it's the year 2024, it is shocking the quality of incident response that has both occurred and not been directly responded to. Next slide. Okay, so the other example, and we've talked quite a bit about this, is that moving to a post-quantum PKI and existing in sort of a steady state of what a post-quantum PKI and authentication in TLS will look like, especially in light of the significant performance costs associated with post-quantum cryptography. The post-quantum PKI is going to be functionally disparate from the non-post-quantum PKI, right? You have a PKI that offers classical security, and you're going to need one that offers both classical security and post-quantum security. So new CAs will need to be spun up, and they'll need to be accepted by clients. Clients may include different hierarchies at different time. Some clients just may not accept them at all. And that does not mean that these clients no longer need to be supported. And so especially in a transitional period, what this means is that at any given point in time, there will be must support clients in a variety of different points of this transition that will need to be accommodated by servers. So this is a de facto diversity of clients that will not have sort of a ubiquitous set of post-quantum CAs. Now, just looking backwards, thinking about how do we get to the existing ubiquitous set? The ubiquitous set, for example, for RSA, formed when the web and the web PKI were tiny by current standards. There was a literal handful number of CAs in existence, and most servers just picked one from this set, and this set was, for many years under 5. Now, this is sort of highlighting a simple sort of transition in which we do something that looks like a direct X509 migration. That may not actually be the case. Different clients may actually opt for different trade-offs with their certificates and impose different requirements on their certificates that authenticate in their clients due to the significant performance cost of PQC. For example, one could imagine one user agent saying, I demand transparency and I want to make sure that it complies with all requirements. So I want to support the strongest MLDSA, right? So I want to see 3 SETs that are MLDSA. That's my napkin math, I don't know, 10,000 bytes, something like that. Another client may simply say, that's ridiculous, right? Like this is going to hurt my clients. This is going to hurt my users on a performance capacity for something that I don't care that much about, right? And so in this situation, you have this differing motivations and different set of trade-offs that each client is making on behalf of their users. Now, to touch on a comment that I think was raised in chat earlier, this introduces a dimensionality that cannot directly be supported by signature algorithms or the extensions. In part because if you've looked at some of the other proposals in this space to address the performance costs of PQC, you have things like proposals in the shape of Merkle tree certs, for example. These things are incompatible between X509 and Merkle tree certs. And if a web server is sitting there and has a connection being made to it, it needs to decide which do I send to whom, right? And so if, I don't expect, for example, Merkle tree certs to be ubiquitously supported by TLS clients. There may be clients out there that want some sort of fast issuance, roughly countersigned shaped or signed by a trusted intermediary solution, and that is all they support. And so the dimensionality here is something that can't be supported by a simple, I support these algorithms, and it's also something that can't be supported by a flag date transition. We can't reason about this purely temporally. Now, even if at some point these clients who are making different trade-off decisions eventually agree, that in turn kicks off yet another transition that I mentioned in the first half of this slide that will take time to converge. Next slide. Can I get the next slide? Oh, there we go. Oh, cool. Thanks. Okay, so just to parallel from these motivating examples that we've seen, I wanted to talk about the benefits of solving this so-called trust hustle as we see it. We have, and again, this is entirely solution agnostic. I'm not talking about what type of mechanism is going to do this. I'm purely talking about the benefits as we see them to solving the underlying problem. If we can solve this underlying conflict, we have a situation where constrained trust stores don't impede the security decisions for Agile clients. This is very much the case today, that Agile security motivated clients are held back by constrained trust stores. And so if we can solve this underlying conflict, we have a situation where constrained trust stores don't impede the security decisions for Agile clients. This is very much the case today, that Agile security motivated clients are held back by constrained trust stores. And so if we can solve this underlying conflict, we have a situation where constrained trust stores don't impede the security decisions for Agile clients. This is very much the case today, that Agile these constrained stress scores, especially on distrust events, like I mentioned. If we solve this problem, clients could implement these CT policies that best serve their users without having to consider the fact that the first mover in this space was able to enact the most preferable policy for themselves, and others are forced into a lesser or a different policy out of this compatibility consideration. It would be the case that a client's CT misbehavior, for instance, on the Apple clients who could not be updated, we would not need to dictate ecosystem-wide decisions to accommodate one client's behavior. We could work between these and serve old clients based on what they required and new clients based on what they did. It would also be the case that new root programs, lowering the barrier to entry for root programs, because they would be free to only accept the CAs that best serve their users, and wouldn't have to sort of make a default compatibility decision and then sort of root it out from there, because distrusts are painful and costly to both a root program and to the web PKI and the TLS ecosystem at large. And then finally, servers could also support an increasingly diverse client base without relying on heuristics and fingerprinting. And when I talk about client base here, I'm talking about not just the different sets of browsers and TLS clients from different vendors, but also the time horizon of versions of these clients that are supported over time that have diverged, especially with things like root agility coming in, where we're seeing changes in trust stores happen at a rate that just simply hasn't happened yet. And so, this ability to automatically support this diverse client base without needing to sort of sniff connections and say, I think you only support RSA. I think you only support EC. Here, I've got these 2 certificates. I'm going to guess and hope I get it right most of the time. Okay, and then I'm going to pass it back over. Thanks.
Next slide. So I'm going to quickly speak briefly to the trust store convergence amongst clients. While we definitely will see trust store divergence, possibly being enabled. Adding a mechanism to address the pain caused by diversity will naturally remove some of the pressure for client trust stores to converge to a similar set of CAs. Servers would be then able to present differing certificates to divergent clients. But even with support for that automated, servers aren't going to just maintain a cost for doing this for every single client on the planet. It is, even though the cost of adding potentially an automated certificate to your server is small, it's not zero. You still have to have this go on. You still have to maintain it. You still have to ensure that this software is working and you're not going to have an outage because of it. They're most likely not going to be willing to maintain and monitor an excessive number of certificate chains. The other factor that will still mean that convergence happens is a good CA that's both trustworthy and offers value to both clients and servers is still a good CA. Clients that are maintaining and actively curating a root store for trust and a similar security policy are still very likely going to converge on mutually trusting the same good CA. Servers will also be incentivized to probably converge towards using good CAs that are reliable and they simplify their operations. So there's likely still to be good CAs that are commonly trusted by modern clients maintaining your root stores. So clients remain incentivized to converge. Solving the trust problem and adding the ability to deal with diversity just means that we are able to balance the incentive to converge with other needs in the web PKI. Next slide. So when we think about the consequences of the status quo, ecosystem convergence is valuable, but if we keep the status quo, it means we prioritize this above all other needs in the PKI. We've seen repeatedly how this leads to bad outcomes for server operators and ultimately for users. So clients are pushed to increase user risk and servers are forced to break clients at a time not of their choosing, and we ossify the ecosystem in a way that prevents security and other improvements. The next slide. And so to recap and finish it off, we remind you, this is the problem that we today feel it's worth solving. We hope we've demonstrated here and that we and others in the ecosystem have this problem today. And we'd like to see that this is within the scope of the TLS working group and to work with the TLS working group to find a standardized solution to this problem. Thanks very much.
Wow, that was almost perfect timing, Bob. Hopefully it wasn't rushing you too fast at the end there. I guess what we're going to do is switch to the other deck, unless we have some clarifying questions. Brendan?
Hey, so I had a question for Devin when he was talking about the semantic case study. Why in the semantic case did you not pursue a cross sign, or did you and it did not work for some reason?
So I didn't pursue, well, okay, so we as a root program don't pursue cross signs. It wasn't like, that would have been a PKI operator consideration. I can't really opine too deeply on why CA operators may not have wanted to cross sign this infrastructure. But I will note that there is a bit of a shared fate problem where if a CA cross-signs another organization and that organization misissues, they are held responsible for that misissuance. So I can't speak to necessarily why the CAs didn't want to do that, but I can provide a reason for why a CA may not have wanted to do that, given the scale and breadth of the failures that led to the distrust.
Well, my question was more so, why did semantic not cross-sign somebody else that was still trusted?
I believe at the time they were in acquisition talks with another CA, and that may have been why they pursued that route over all others.
Okay, I think Dennis, you're up. You got 67 slides.
Hey, folks.
I'm dying to know your time management skills here. It's going to be great.
Okay.
Sorry.
Hey, Sean, can you get someone to take over the notes? I'm gonna have to leave in like a half hour, and I want to make sure that we don't have discontinuity.
Yes. David's going to take over, and Brendan is going to double. That's awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Definitely can hear you fine.
Wonderful. Okay. So it's always difficult giving the position for no when you're not quite sure what the case for yes is going to be in advance. I think the chairs have covered this pretty well, but we're here to have a conversation. And I think above all else, we're here to figure out what it is the problem that we want to solve. And in terms of how I'm going to approach that, I want to talk a bit about root store divergence in the real world. And here it's going to be interesting, because I think we do have slightly different perspectives on this. And I think ultimately it's an objective thing that we can come to agree on or not. And then more generally, I'm going to try and talk about the use cases. And I certainly won't talk about all of these use cases today. This was much more, depending on what folks in the room were interested in hearing about, we'd talk about some of these specific ones or not. So in terms of the divergence factors that Chris and I think Chrome have kind of proposed, it's very much around the need to make independent decisions, the need to make particularly restrictive decisions, and the fact that updates arrive at different times. And while clients do make independent decisions, they're making them to what is essentially the same criteria according to their judgment. So, every root program is ultimately trying to identify the same set of organizations which can be trusted to issue certificates for their users. And that's a benefit risk analysis which is largely shared between the different root programs. And when Chris kind of talks about the intersection between these different root programs, I think it's really helpful to put some numbers on that, some concrete numbers. So when we look at the root certificates today, shared between Apple, Chrome, Mozilla, and Microsoft, we see that there's 107 root certificates which are shared between every root program. And in particular, like this, you'll notice the size of these sets is quite different, where Microsoft's set size is a little bit extreme in one direction. Chrome and Apple are less likely to have root certificates that are only trusted by them and not by anybody else. And Mozilla is somewhere in between these two extremes. And there are reasons for that we'll talk about later. And when we kind of talk about the CT policy world, in this case, the Venn diagram is literally currently a circle. And again, there are reasons for that. But I think it's interesting that both Apple and Chrome have managed to uniformly agree on who should be trusted to operate a transparency log. And there's no divergence here, at least at the present. And like none of these things are an accident. Like today, behind the scenes, all the major root programs use the common CA database, which is managed by the Linux Foundation. This is where details about the root certificates and the CAs are stored. This is where communication with CA happens. This is where they file applications. And this is all shared infrastructure that the root programs combine and support together. And with the CAB browser forum, this is fundamentally how the rules are made today. Now, while root programs can introduce their own independent requirements, because we're all sort of living in the same landscape, there's a coordination mechanism, a consensus-based mechanism, that respects that both root programs and certificate authorities have valuable perspectives to bring. And because of that, there's essentially a voting process for making improvements here. By and large, these votes usually go pretty smoothly, but there's been discord from time to time, particularly around certificate lifetimes. And I think everybody could criticize the CAB forum, or indeed essentially any kind of stakeholder-based system, as being, slow-moving or inefficient in some respects, or being time-consuming or difficult to work with. And I think I would probably agree with all of those concerns. But I would also say I think it may be the best system available to us, despite those shortcomings. And I think we might talk about what some of those alternatives are later. The second aspects that were proposed more relate to certificate pinning, which we've not talked too much about, so I'm just going to breeze past. And then around clients delivering updates at different rates. And here, again, switching the focus from root certificates to CAs, the number of roots would have been universally trusted for quite some time, at least 10 plus years, is pretty high. And I think we've got to respect that when users go on the web today, they don't care about root store divergence or the different flavors of certificates. They grab a certificate from one of the ubiquitously trusted CAs and they go on with their day. And to a large extent, that is proof that the system is working effectively, because if more people had to care about the web PKI, it would mean that we were doing a worse job. So there's quite a difficult, I think there's quite a clear difference of opinion there, and quite a difficult difference of opinions to resolve in how I think maybe the previous presenters and myself feel about the nature of divergence here and kind of its use cases and not. When we think about divergence, it's functionally about adding and removing CAs. I think the overwhelming community consensus is that it probably doesn't need to be easier to add new CAs. We're probably hoping that it's going to be harder in the near future. And when we look at the intersection between the different root programs at the moment, we kind of have this happy core of 107. When we look at those CAs that are more towards the margins, it's not a very happy list. It's CAs that are operated by governments and have quite unclear or quite limited purposes. CA root certificates operated by the Australian Department of Defence, the government of Finland's Population Registrar Centre, and the government of Korea. It's CAs that have been removed from the majority of the root programs because of non-compliance, like eTogra, eCommerce, Certinomis. And it's also CAs that are in the process of being included but have not yet been processed by all the root stores yet. So as a general rule, we're not interested in making adding CAs functionally easier. And this is for really good, quite structural reasons, that CA value is currently proportional to how universally trusted you are. At the moment, to be an effective CA on the web PKI, you need to be trusted by everybody. And that boils down to 4 independent checks and balances that you're a worthwhile CA. If you do not have that kind of universal trust, you will not get that kind of economic reward for being a CA because you cannot be used effectively. And also it's easier and less disruptive to be removed if you don't have a wide user base. Secondly, like a time to ubiquity is a fitness function that helps ensure that we have healthy CAs. It effectively acts as like you need a certain amount of economic resources to persist whilst you're waiting for that ubiquity. And of course, you can ask for a cross sign to achieve ubiquity much faster. Like this is something that Let's Encrypt did. You can negotiate with an existing CA to receive that cross sign. And effectively, this acts as an even higher security bar, because not only are you now passing the root program vetting, it's that the cross signer will now face significant, essentially personal liability in return for vouching for you. So again, this is a system of checks and balances that works reasonably well, in my opinion. Now, in terms of removing a CA from a root program, I think this is much more exciting. Removal of CAs ought to be relatively rare. If we are removing CAs, it's because our inclusion criteria was not good. And there's an interesting question about the more historical CAs there that I think Chrome have raised in this conversation. But I think, again, a lot of those considerations boil down to understanding the value between like long-lived trust and whether that trust still continues to be worthwhile. But when we do come to remove a CA for cause, for reasons that it's fallen short of root program expectations, then it's a pretty painful and traumatic experience at the moment. I've been personally involved in quite a few of these now. And things that happen to a root program when it tries to remove a CA is that the CEO of that CA will try to call you. The CEO of that CA will try to call your CEO. The CEO of that CA will talk to everybody it can find and try to have them all call your CEO to put pressure on you to change the decision. Lawyers will threaten an antitrust complaint or some other abusive process. And ultimately, that CA may try to lobby to pass laws to override your decision-making power. And the reason that these things happen is an inescapable consequence of the trust decision that has to be made. The CA is fighting for survival, and it will therefore trigger a survival response to exert pressure in whatever ways that it can. Now, the technical parts of removing a CA are pretty smooth and secure. And I think Chrome actually have by far the best practice here because they've recently introduced SCT distrust after. I won't talk about that in too much detail now. But in terms of the pain that we have, it's primarily from the social and business aspects. And if someone was to come to me today and say, why couldn't we have a root program with many fewer CAs present? It's because ultimately it's a stakeholder-based environment. And attempts to course correct that ship too fast and too far have a very real way of rebounding on us and causing counterproductive effects, shall we say. I think more generally around some of the points that were also raised in the Chrome presentation is that they were historical. The web PKI has changed an awful lot over the past 5 to 10 years, and one of the most important changes has been the reduction of certificate lifetimes and the increases of automation. So when people talk around things like the semantic distrust, I think it's very important to keep in mind, when semantic was distrusted, it was possible to buy a TLS certificate that lasted for 5 years. And in that world, people operated and acted completely differently. Like leaf certificates were effectively permanent from an employee's point of view. If they bought a certificate, they probably weren't going to be around to actually replace it. And that caused significant problems, especially when people were shipping devices with a less than 5-year time span and had no real incentive to care about longer than that. These days, with the shorter lived certificates, with Acme, with automation, the picture here looks much better. And we have much more agility than we used to have in the past. I'm not going to talk too much about backwards compatibility for websites, but I would highlight that, as well as all these root stores having to ultimately align on what they think is in, and I think as the Chrome team alluded to, we ought to be able to agree on who's in our root store. Like fundamentally, if a CA is being removed from one root store, that's either a good decision, that's a net win for user security, which should be emulated, or it's a mistake and which it shouldn't have been removed in the first place. But everybody is applying effectively the same criteria and ought to be able to come to a consensus on that move. This really leaves temporal root store divergence as the main problem in this space. And here again, the picture is pretty good on most platforms. If you're on an Apple device, on a Windows device, you've been enjoying automatic root store updates for Microsoft's part all the way back to Service Pack 3 of Windows XP. Browsers are similarly doing a pretty good job. Linux distros have the ability to ship these updates automatically, and interestingly, they'll ship removals within 24 hours, which is fantastic for user security. But they do additions very slowly. They'll only add new root certificates with a major version bump. Now, Android is really the outlier here, and until October 2023, aka about this time last year, it wasn't possible to update the root store on Android without a manufacturer firmware update. And the vast majority of manufacturers have no interest in providing firmware updates at all, let alone firmware updates to update the root store. So for the long history of Android, root stores have been write once, update never. And that's caused the vast majority of the problems in this space. But since Android 14, October 2023, this is finally fixed. And if you sort of look back at people talking about certificate changes and the general kind of problems in this space when CAs or websites are migrating or CDNs, you will find Android mentioned as the main culprit and the main villain. And in terms of adoption, Android 14 is already at about 33%. There's certainly going to be a long tail here of these older devices, but we have the ability to support them today anyway with cross-signing, which is ubiquitously used by every major CA today, including Google Trust Services, Digicert, Sector. Let's Encrypt stopped using their Android cross-sign in the last couple of months because they felt it was no longer necessary with the dwindling fraction of Android devices that were out of date. So I think overall, I interpret this as pretty positive news. I think it's fair to say there's quite a few externalities as well for having older devices that aren't up to date besides the root store, but I'll come on to those in a little bit. So a big feature that's kind of been touched on is the power of agility and the utility of agility. And I think in Chrome's presentation, they focused on agility very much from the root program's perspective and the client's perspective, which is that we'd like to introduce new features as fast as possible. But I think it's equally valid to look at this from the website's perspective. The website wants to change certificate change, it wants to ship a new standard or a new feature, and it wants to do that through some kind of negotiation to enable that agility so that it can avoid compatibility mistakes. And really, whether you look at this from the client perspective or the server perspective, we're talking functionally about some kind of negotiation to enable agility. Now, my 2 pennies on this is that the problems here are primarily not within the root stores. We have a reasonably good grasp of what's in the root stores at a different point in time. We have cross-signing that allows us to bring trust backwards in time. But we really struggle to know whether a given client will actually support a given cert chain in practice. It's easy to do it in theory, just looking at the root stores. It's much harder to understand that diversity in the real world. And that's because there's pain from every layer of the network and OS stack. So the TLS libraries have all kinds of hidden bugs that only trigger in rare circumstances. They're going to break compatibility. Maybe they don't tolerate large certificates. Maybe they don't tolerate large certificate chains. Maybe they advertise support for a particular RSA PSS, but they actually can only handle in hardware PKCS v1.5. There's even more divergence at the certificate validation layer, which I think is known to be a bit of a black spot for standardization. And even when we get all the way up to the application layer, you can know the TLS library you're talking to, you can know the certificate validation library you're talking to, you can know its configuration, but an application can choose to use that library and then pull the certificate chain out using any one of the common API functions for doing so, and then go and do its own validation, its own restrictions, its own processing on it, and maybe even its own pinning. And this means that the diversity of tolerance in this space is not innumerable. You can't meaningfully today write down what toleration means or what compatibility means. And that makes a negotiation story around this extremely hard. And I'm just talking about the situation today if we were trying to clear this up, maybe less so around the situation in the future if we're moving to something different. But in terms of what we would then need to expose to make this work, we need to expose some kind of label that will explain, either the client supports this or the server supports the following, and they're both going to have to agree on what that label is. And the central point I'm trying to make is that label actually extends well beyond what the root store is. So it's not as simple as just saying, I have the Chrome roots issued in 2025 Q1. I need to know whether I'm talking to the Chrome browser with the Chrome root store and full path validation support and a very well-maintained certificate validation implementation, or if I'm talking to old OpenSSL 1.1 with the Chrome root store. because we know that they're going to diverge massively in what kind of certificates that they can support. And ultimately, when we talk about that negotiation, we need to agree on what those labels are going to mean. And there's only really two choices for this. These labels are either implementation defined. There will be a document somewhere called the Chrome Validation Policy 2025 Q1, or there will be a label somewhere that points to an RFC and says, if you advertise this label, it means that you're compliant with RFC 999 certificates. Now, given that we've tried to standardize this space in the past, and it simply hasn't worked, it's never taken, I guess that we're going to have to be talking about some kind of implementation defined policy. And I think that was also implicit in the Chrome talk when we talk about, say, different SCT policies. We're talking about something that's dynamic, it's shifting over time, and it's implementation specific. But implementation defined labels are user agents. And user agents suck. If there's one story from the web, it's that user agents don't work the way people hope they work. You know, back in the dim, dark ages of early HTTP, people said, well, wouldn't it be great if we could advertise what browser this was and the website could send us the right HTML? They wouldn't necessarily know what the browser.
All right, is it just me? Or did Dennis go away?
Not
I
just you.
lost audio.
You lost him.
Yeah.
Oh, coming back. Cross some fingers. All right. Dennis, I think we're still having some audio problems. Okay. Those interwebs. All right. Oh.
How's this doing?
Much better.
Looks like it was a permissions issue. Guess I'm going to have to find a bug on that. Okay, so coming back to the flow. So yeah, ultimately what I fear that we're trying to do here is reinvent the user agent string for the TLS handshake. And the idea is going to be that there'll be some way of sending a policy about what we expect. That policy is going to be implementation defined. And that ultimately clients and servers are going to be expected to understand and align on what that means, but will not be able to do so in practice because this is an exceedingly complicated space. What we also see with user agent strings is that there are strong incentives to lie to just make things work. And like a classic example of this would be that if you're operating, say, a different browser derived from Chromium with a very slightly different certificate store, you're probably quite tempted to send whatever Chrome will send as its TLS user agent, because that's what's going to unlock the new features that Chrome is shipping for you. Websites and servers are typically not going to be configured to support your particular user agent, your particular string. So you better say, well, I support the Chrome one as well, or I support the Chrome one in addition, to make sure that you get something that works for you. And this, I think, is a real flaw to this kind of proposal. I really think that if you have a proposal that can negotiate anything, then it's more likely to be able to negotiate essentially nothing in practice, because people are going to disagree on what it means, and it's going to get stuck. It can also have really negative externalities. Like we might, be able to do this. I don't think we should, but if we were, are we actually fixing anything about this problem space? Are we just putting a label on it and then we're just trying to tolerate it? In terms of agility, we might get agility for browsers. I think that's not impossible because we know that we can update browsers, but it can mean stagnation for everybody else. And that burden really then falls on websites to maintain compatibility with a very, very long tail of stuff that no longer has any incentive to try to keep up because there's now a mechanism for not having to do so. I would also say that, like, in terms of a deployment goal, it's clear that from like the client perspective, you only have to care about getting this on your clients. Like if you get this on your clients, You can wash your hands of the rest of the problem space because that's now somebody else's problem. But from the server operator space, your challenge is now all the clients you support. So if you end up in a world where, for example, browsers all adopt this system and are now effectively labeled, you've probably not made your world that much better because browsers were quite homogeneous to start with and were quite easy to test. But where you see a real diversity in implementation, that's where you want to do some kind of negotiation and want to have some kind of agility. But you don't have a way to distinguish them because they're either not adopting the scheme, because it's hard to deploy, or because it takes a lot of coordination to deploy with CAs or with standards bodies. So I think there's just some real fundamental technical and engineering challenges, not with any particular solution, but with the very idea of trying to define a negotiation mechanism that works for anything. My super pessimistic take on what you can do instead is continue to suffer, to be honest. We currently already, work to reduce and identify divergences in the TLS libraries. We have websites that do experimentation. We have engineers that are trying to write better standards. And it sucks that this is the future, but I think it's also, at least it's job security is maybe the best and only good thing you could say about it. But this kind of mess of the real world will not improve by just labeling it and then saying, well, I've labeled my devices, so websites, good luck. I expect you to know how to talk to me. I think that's a very bad philosophy for everything. It's not the philosophy of what we do here, which is fundamentally to align on a standard that everybody shares. I'm going to go through this, although it wasn't directly mentioned. I think the images are great. So ultimately, a good mental model of browser TLS today and non-browser TLS today is this. The browsers are to some extent on a tug, pulling forwards, trying to do the right thing. Behind them, they have the entire weight of the rest of the web PKI and all the devices that are on it, from medical stuff, from smart TVs to old phones, to old automobiles that are just not getting updated. And they're pulling forwards. And it's a burden. It's a massive, massive burden to try and pull this forwards. And there's a certain seductive motivation to just going it alone. It'd be faster, it'd be quicker, we'd have less to worry about, we'd have less to wait, and we could just get our jobs done and go home. However, I think in practice that would mean we'd abandon everybody else and we'd leave them behind. And I think pretty fast they would run aground, and I think pretty fast they would sink. And the negative externalities of that are huge. That if these devices are not, aligned on some kind of modern TLS style protocol, and that they are not benefiting from a PKI that is secure, then all of our lives are worse. And I question that browsers going slightly faster is beneficial over everything else getting worse. So, my vision for that is that where there are problems, where there are pain points, and I think, to be fair, transparency and SCTs are a major, major pain point. We should work on new solutions that can align everybody better and bring everybody back to one single TLS and a PKI that works effectively for everybody. I don't think there are actually any fundamental trade-offs there in requirements. Yeah, in terms of quick thoughts on the transition to a PQ PKI, I think by far this is the most compelling problem on the table. But ultimately, negotiation is not the pressing concern. We need to align on what that long-term vision looks like, what the requirements are for it, and the strategy for getting there. And it's important we do that sooner rather than later. It's much more important to agree on these things than it is to be shipping code. In terms of negotiation, I think that is the last thing that we need to do, because we've gotten pretty good at doing negotiation in TLS 1.3. It's not like we're struggling and thinking, how are we ever going to improve? We have a well-oiled negotiation mechanism with extensions. We know that it does a much, much better job than TLS 1.2, which had lots of hideous mistakes around the cipher suites. And in terms of root ubiquity, I really don't understand people that say that this is going to be a problem. And I'm happy to talk about it in more detail. But a classical cross sign on a PQ chain does not damage the PQ security of that chain for the clients that have the PQ root. So today, if somebody wanted to issue a PQ root, they could classically cross sign it with their existing classical root CA certificate, and they could ship that to all clients that had PQ signature support, regardless of whether or not those clients had the new PQ root. It simply wouldn't matter. Now, there's other barriers to doing that today, which is frankly the economic cost of the HSMs, the fact the FIP standards are so recent, the fact that the hardware isn't ready yet. But root ubiquity is not a challenge to my mind in this circumstance. I've tried to sort of address this in terms of Chris's questions, which is that, from my perspective, divergence is small, it's narrowing, especially as Android catches up, and that convergent ecosystem forces dominate. And when people talk about like the need to diverge, it's not a language I can understand. Like, I'm open to a conversation about why that's felt to be the case or what that would unlock. But ultimately, it doesn't seem to me that there's anything that's stopping a root program from removing CAs apart from the business and social considerations that I mentioned earlier, which turn out to be severe and very, very critical and are not solvable by changing anything in the TLS handshake. In terms of like where the operational pain is, I sort of hear it when websites say, we want to make this better, we want to make this more agile. But I really think arbitrary negotiation mechanisms don't do what you hope that they're going to do. The only way forward to do negotiation right is to have well-defined standardized semantics that everybody can agree on what they mean. And that allows the negotiation to be effective. In terms of the PQ-PKI problem, yeah, as I said, completely agree we need to solve this and soon. But this is very much at the thinking stage, not at the shipping code stage. And it's not at all at the negotiation stage. Whatever we do for PQ, it will need, most likely, its own negotiation mechanism, unless we're going to do the very boring classical cross-sign and signature algorithms that I mentioned earlier. And then in terms of the downstream effects, I really think, from a server operator's perspective, agility is a very mixed bag. Like, it's a great thing for clients. If you only maintain one client implementation, it's fantastic. But it's much less clear that it's valuable for servers who then have the headache of managing all those different clients. And again, we didn't talk about today, like, the externalities of this, because I sort of see the external risks of establishing new root programs as quite separate from the goals, like the actual problems that people have come to the working group with. But I think at some future point, it seems like that's going to have to be a question we're going to have to address.
Okay. I just want to say thank you very much for all of the presenters following the suggested time. We are doing great here. So now we're going to kind of open up the floor a little bit. It's a little more free flowing. So my hope is that this is not going to turn into a let's bash the web PKI. Let's not turn this into a bash company X, Y, or Z or browser X, Y, or Z. But I'd like to hear from other people. I know specifically that we had
So Sean, just before we dive in, would it be okay if I answered some questions? Because I see there's a couple of questions in the chat about just for clarification.
Yeah.
So Paul, you can't trust PQ, non-PQ cross signs, so why do them? I want to maybe unpack that a little bit. So in this scenario, we have a PQ certificate with a PQ intermediate, let's say, and a PQ root. And then at the very end of that, we have a cross sign from a classical CA. The nice thing about this certificate chain is that if you support the PQ root, you don't care about the fact there's a classical signature stuck on the end. It doesn't reduce the security for it. It doesn't have any downsides. And if you think about it this way, a classical CA can sign whatever certificate chain it likes, and it doesn't reduce the security of that chain. It's, if anything, an additional vouch for it. Meanwhile, if you are a PQ client and you don't yet have the new PQ root, you're not going to get security from that certificate chain regardless, because you don't have the PQ root, but at least you get it compatibility with the classical root. So cross-signing between classical and PQ, I think, is a mutual win-win in terms of compatibility and security.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, so Dennis, I think you made some points about the user agent string as a sort of flag that some kinds of negotiation might not work. Do we actually have any experience as to what kinds of negotiation do or don't work that would really touch on this? I'm not sure that we do. I mean,
I think we've learned from things like TLS, like we can negotiate cipher suites really well, right? And the reason we can do that is that we agree what that cipher suite means. It has a very precise mathematical definition. And we can test for compatibility with that definition pretty well. We can test that an implementation is actually implementing it correctly and securely. And so because of that, we can negotiate that just fine. When we move on to things where we can't actually identify what they are. So for example, I'm thinking about like, how does certificate validation really work today in any given browser? We can't really define that as anything other as just the standard is what the code does, right?
Okay, I'm not 100% convinced, but okay. With cyber suites, if you try and use some really oddball ones, you might run into problem negotiating anyway. So, but
sure. I mean, these things all benefit from where people have spent energy and investment. But I think it's probably fair to say, writing the test case suite for like path validation or X509 measurably harder than writing it for like AES 128.
David, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, like Dennis said, we have plenty of experience in negotiation schemes all throughout TLS, and we sort of did not spend a whole lot of time on solutions in this meeting since we were talking about the problem statement. But I think if you look at both of our drafts, they're both have very well-defined meanings for like what the messages say. And in fact, we have plenty of smart people in this working group. I think we can certainly come up with a solution, come up with a mechanism with well-defined meanings. The X509 validation is indeed a morass of complexity, but we have a document that says what it means. And I think, we haven't spent I think we sort of collectively as like implementers have spent far less energy on X509 validation than I would like. But that is also something that can be smoothed over. Like a trust anchor is a well-defined concept in X509. It is true that like verification is kind of a mess when it comes to path building, but if you think about where path building comes from, that's actually a weak form of trust anchor, like dealing with trust anchor diversity in itself, because the client, the relying party just wants one particular path. And ideally the server would simply send that. But in practice, the server needs to send like a morass of things, partly because sometimes servers just get things wrong, but also because they need to try to, in one packets, work with clients that support multiple routes. And one of the things that we noticed while we were working through these problems is that path building and agility and like negotiation are actually tightly related. And once you solve the agility problem, then the servers can send exactly the right chain to the clients, and then we don't have quite as much variability here. And in fact, one of the things we've done in our proposals is to make sure that clients are able to recognize when the server is doing this negotiation thing, turn off path building, and that way the larger clients can help enforce the rest of the ecosystem sees simpler stuff, and then hopefully we will like converge a little bit better. Because I don't think it's a good thing that like OpenSSL and all the browsers and like curl and everyone else all like interpret X509 in completely different ways. We should do better than that.
Yeah, I mean, so David, I really agree, like on the desire to do better in that particular area. But maybe what I'm trying to hone in on, when eventually we have some negotiation mechanism, whether it's trust expressions or trust anchor identifiers or any other solution, we will kind of have to agree on what the labels that go into that mean. Now, if the labels just mean it's this particular list of keys in a root store at some point, I accept that that's pretty well standardized. And I think we can write down some simple rules that go with that about like the valid certificate chains. But with the wider question about like whether this certificate chain needs an SCT or the more varied things that can happen around like the different signature algorithms and the different complexities, I think that's where it gets really tricky. And that's where we kind of end up in a situation where it necessarily ends up kind of implementation defined. So that would be my kind of response. Kyle, is this a question on like clarification, or is this the start of the discussion?
It's okay.
It's okay, whichever it is. It's just
discussion. I don't know for.
Yeah.
Let me.
Yeah. So let me. Watson, is this also a clarifying question or discussion?
I think it's a clarifying question. It seems that you've sort of talked about kind of the consequences of making this move. It's not just about certificate. It's not just about expressing the roots necessarily.
Right.
And I think that's where some of the some of the comments earlier in line have been. But that's sort of when we had the discussion, we should try to think, okay, one of the outcomes might be that no, this is not just about the roots, it's about changing the whole way we assign trust to DNS entities.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. That that's what I'm trying to articulate. It is strictly larger than just the roots to define this in a well-meaning way, and then it becomes a question about what that is. And I think that the difficulty there is that it becomes very, very implementation specific, very fast, and very, very difficult to standardize. And particularly if it's going to be, an SCT from my particular transparency log, it's necessarily implementation defined. What does compatibility with that mean? You'll necessarily have to go and check something else. Presumably hosted on the client website.
Okay, Kyle, you're up first, and then we're going to have an open queue. Want to make sure that we stay focused on the problem statement and don't dive too much into the actual solutions at this point. So basically what we're trying to figure out is, do people think that they understand what the problem statement is? And I'm going to try to cheat and drop it in, which I think Chris summarized nicely in one of his slides. And I'm going to try to see if I can't find it and drop it in. But Kyle, feel free to jump back in the line and kick the conversation off, okay?
All right, sure. I'll just start with what I was going to say before. On the user agent negotiation, or really negotiation of certificate properties, I completely agree that there's a much wider space of different things that can be negotiated. And that certainly includes things like what CT logs are trusted, the exact CT policy, and all of that. I think that there is a pretty big difference between saying that we shouldn't even attempt to negotiate any of this versus we need to have a solution that allows for negotiation of every single different piece. We have had changes in certificates that are trusted by a client and usable by different clients with different negotiation mechanisms before. Right now, we actively use negotiation for signature algorithms, so like RSA or ECDSA certificates, and that works perfectly fine. I think a lot of sites switch between those today. We had a previous instance, something like 8 or 9 years ago, where we deprecated SHA-1 signatures. That was not negotiated, or at least not negotiated in the clients that were affected that didn't support TLS 1.2 for the most part. And that was a quite painful negotiation to even decide whether a client was going to be affected. So I think that when we have the ability to negotiate parts of what clients are able to trust, we should do what we can.
Go ahead, Adam.
All right. Hello. I'm Adam. I'm not usually in the TLS working group these days, but for my seemingly numerous SIMs in a past life, one thing I do is manage Google's TLS serving. And some of the Chrome folks asked me to select some shareable instances over the past decade of problems we have had with certificates. So Google for a long time had a very copacetic certificate situation because we used one CA and it kept going, but then eventually it expired. And now I have had to repeatedly pick root certificates. And it's relatively straightforward to go test some root with the big clients. That's not the problem. The problem is I have to balance how old a root is with how close it is to expiration, and hope like heck that it works with the vast number of clients that we know nothing about. Now, obviously, the impacts are power law distributed, and I'm going to be talking about some of the bigger ones. So extrapolates to the numerous instances I won't be mentioning that are smaller. We have had multiple instances where we have broken more than 1 million unupdatable devices in the field, and they have died. In more than one case, these devices have turned into a DDoS network because they retried connections in a loop. And we could not just turn off the endpoint because there was legitimate traffic still on it. Even when devices can be updated, it takes months, sometimes more than 6, to actually get an update in the field, even when they are dead in the water and there is no additional pressure we could bring to bear. We have broken so many integrations with Google, I've lost count. In one case, we took out in-car navigation for a major brand of cars across the whole world. And often these things are not reported to us until we have broken more than 10% of the world. We have paid a CA to dig up the card sets for an expired route in order to exploit a bug in a client which didn't check route expirations to get a certificate issued so that we could just have something that worked for this client. There have been multiple instances where people have lost the source code to their system, but their software update still works, and I have had to binary patch their code for them to add routes. And all this is because we cannot determine what routes are going to work before we try them, because there is no negotiation. We have had multiple instances where we've had to hire teams of people to open every box in a warehouse and manually flash some firmware update on devices that haven't been sold. We have had to shut down an entire Google service because of these issues. It's interactive with devices made by partners. While we have instructions about how to produce devices with a reasonable trust score, these partners had a diverse set of interpretations of these rules, and a certificate change ended up wiping out so many of them that the service became unviable, was shut down, and the team was disbanded. I have had to have meetings with IoT companies where I've had to explain to them that because of timelines and route expirations, their company is going bankrupt. And those are painful meetings to have. And these are all because I have to pick a route and we have no idea if it works. And these transitions take over 12 months to do. So that is just sort of a report on the reality of dealing with these issues as a large site.
Thanks, Adam. Dennis?
I just wanted to thank Adam for coming to share with us. And also as a quick response to David and Beck, sorry, I was not looking at the screen share. I was busy looking at Zulip. I think the comment I would make on this definition is it's very clear from like the Chrome presentation that it's not current, like the intent here, the problems here that are being described, I don't think are limited to one specific thing. It's a much broader question of policy. And that having one extension that can fundamentally like negotiate anything, I think is just it's a bad premise to start from. Like, I think there's a different premise, which is that we start from like trust anchor lists. And to be clear, I still don't like that premise. But I think like trying to introduce an extension that negotiates effectively everything from post-quantum to anchors to SCTs and perhaps beyond, and like how path validation works, like I don't think that's like fully described here, and I'm sure the Chrome authors will come to the queue to maybe talk us through what they have in scope.
Okay. Andrew?
Yeah, I wanted to share a couple stories as well for my company as to how this has been somewhat painful. We have a very long tail of browser clients on devices which just simply don't update their browsers ever. And for our product, people go to our website, open the website, and then use the product. So for us, we need www.yourcompany.com to be accessible for many generations of browsers, many of which are no longer considered supported by their vendors anymore. And we just need that to work. It's not we don't necessarily have the choice for someone to remember that they are on browser 1.2 of Firefox or whatever, and go to that specific website endpoint to load our website. And so this has caused us to acquire certificates from the most ubiquitous CAs, which really just means the longest lived CAs. And that pool grows ever smaller as those certificates, those CAs expire, and they're all going to become invalid in 2 years, based on what's going to happen in the industry. And so this need to be able to identify these older clients, or in this case, identify newer clients, which are able to have newer trust, which is separated from the older trust, is going to become incredibly important. So we can continue to maintain that long tail of web clients and device clients in some cases for our services. So I guess my point is that I think this is something we really should solve, and it's just going to become a bigger and bigger problem the longer we ignore it.
Oh, I want to kind of second what Andrew and Adam both said. From Meta's perspective, we're currently in the midst of the first root change that we've done, or at least done in the past 10 or 15 years since TLS was in wide use. The fact that we've gotten that far, I think it's mostly luck from the certificates from the route that was chosen around 15 years ago or so. The rollout currently is quite challenging for all the same reasons. I think I won't just go and add on a ton of more specifics from what Adam mentioned earlier, but we are running into similar issues. So I do want to second that.
So I tried to type everything into the chat room and be very friendly to your time, but of course that got screwed up. Basically, I mean, I think it's probably legible. I think overall, doing experiments based on public data, getting results published from those, and thinking about this over the next year or so seems entirely reasonable. I don't think we're clear enough on exactly what problem to solve at this point in time. And if somebody wanted to kind of take the pain to try and write up a modernized, reduced RFC 5280 just for TLS, that'd be great. But I really wonder, does that person exist?
Watson?
Hello. So every time I've had a conversation with someone about the topic, my position ends up changing to what their position is, and that pattern holds true today. I think, the problem seems very compelling. We have these clients that they have old routes that are no longer as trusted as they once were. We've got to pick one. And then, so we've got to have some solution to this. And then I think about sort of the consequences of the solution. And as someone who maintains OpenSSL and Akamai, we recently forked it out to Quick TLS. I think, okay, well, what do I have to do to implement this correctly? And it's just not really possible. We're not really in a position where we know what routes, what the behavior will be at the client, because the client is an application and can do all sorts of things, as Dennis pointed out. And you just don't know as a library author. As an application author, I don't know what you do. So that creates a whole thing where, okay, we might have gotten the route right, but actually there's some detail about the chains that we have available now that's going to cause a problem. We still won't know. So I'm wary of thinking that just negotiating the CAs is, how big a difference is that going to make? And as you start negotiating more, do you then end up with biting off more and more than you can chew? So I think we got to be very disciplined when we set out on solving this problem about making sure that we don't end up, sort of step by step transforming the problem we wanted to solve into a huge mess. I do think that CA convergence, as Dennis pointed out, now we don't really have a huge problem for browsers, but certainly there's all kinds of non-browser things that Akamai we've had to support and keep supporting to this day that have been painful. Brian Sniffen talked about some of this at Crypto 16. We still have some of those same problems. So I do think that as time goes on, we may end up with root expirations or long-lived roots leaving. We might end up having a much more serious problem than we've had in the past. And what we're starting to see are the little cracks.
David Benjamin?
So in terms of the problem we're trying to solve, I mean, it's right here on the screen. The thing to negotiate right here is the trust anchors, mostly the X509 trust anchors, although I think it's been pointed out that we mentioned CT mostly because the sort of structure of the problem is much the same. And so if we're talking about sort of broader ecosystem implications of solving versus not solving a problem, they're like really quite analogous, which is part of like, you know, we extracted this from Merkle's research, which was, at least as written, not based on top of X509, but it's still ultimately the sort of same kinds of shapes of players in the system. I think in terms of things getting like, you know, there are other properties that clients check. Some of them we already do negotiate, like signature algorithms. Some of them are implementation quirks like path building, which are actually no longer, so some of them are path building, which no longer applies after you solve this problem anyway. And some of them are, you know, weird bugs and other things, which are also like, which are certainly like issues to solve. They're not the issues that we are proposing to solve here. I think those sort of, each of those could deserve like, you know, some investigation in itself. Like, is the variation because the CA is not following the rules and not like encoding dir, but like someone accepted BUR anyway? Well, then maybe you should fix the CA. Is it because the client has a bug? Well, let's go fix the bug in the client, and so on. So I think those are like, you know, that's the kind of interop issue that we actually have more experience with at the IETF, where like, oh, there was some TLS implementation that didn't quite get it right, and so we had to move the version field somewhere else, or maybe we ended up just breaking those clients or whatever else. Like, those are decisions we can make, but those are separate to what is in front of us on the screen right now, which is quite simply like, there is a well-defined thing that the clients need to configure, the list of trust anchors, and that dance needs to, and then the server needs to go and react to that dance. And it's something that we have plenty of experience with on the client cert side already. This is, like I said, this has been in TLS since SSL 3 days. We're just looking to expand it to PKIs where the current solution doesn't quite fit.
Scott? Oop, you're still on mute.
Oh, okay. Too many mutes. I want to bring up a potentially unrelated but potentially overlapping similar problem. I was wondering if the working group wants to take this on as part of this problem. Some of our customers want both to be for authentication, want to have both quantum and classical, which might means using multiple certificates at the same time, or it might be using some sort of single certificate which has both. That adds a complexity. My question to the working group is, should this be part of this effort?
Wayne?
I like Scott's question, but I was going to go a different direction. As a representative of both a bootstrapping CA and a large server operator, I agree with most of what's been said today in terms of this being a very important problem to try to solve, as well as a very intractable problem. The point that I would like to make is that my life would be about 80% better if we could only solve half of the problem, that half being allowing the client to signal to the server which routes it actually recognizes. If I can just know that, I would be in a much better place.
Fair enough. Benjamin?
Hi, Ben Schwartz. We've heard a lot of great discussion about the sort of technical ecosystem dynamics, which I think are obviously very important. But I do want to raise again the policy system dynamics that this creates. There have been a number of efforts, and there are ongoing efforts out there in the world to create essentially sovereign certificate issuance rules by governments that effectively mandate the usage or trusting of particular certificates. The requirement to effectively have a global unified trusted CA set is a major barrier to those kinds of efforts. And in the absence of a strong technical reason to to maintain that unified trust set, it becomes much easier for a government to basically mandate the use of a particular certificate, essentially saying you must act like you trust this, even if you really do not trust this. That to me is the scariest thing about all of this, and is the thing that I'd really like to see considered more carefully.
Okay, so I think we've actually drained the queue at the 2-hour mark, which is, again, great that we're actually following along, but I think we need to make some kind of hums here. And I guess I'm going to try to see if we can at least get an understanding that people understand the problem that we are trying to solve. Again, this feels a little bit like a mini BOF. We throw something up and then people do it. So I guess I'm going to try to use the show of hands tool here and write up a little thing. It's going to be yes, no, and don't understand, I guess. It's going to be, do you understand the problem? We are... Baz, go ahead.
Yes, so in the statement, I think already a little bit weaker would be really helpful for us, as I hear from the other server operators. It's not just about negotiating, but also about knowing what will happen. We have absolutely no idea what will happen if we change the root certificate without actually trying it and breaking it, and we don't see which clients will break. So if the text is written, I would say that it's already really useful just that we know or have a partial view of which roots are anchors are trusted by the clients.
Yeah, it really seems to me like there needs to be some like interop runner that's running along with various people, various implementations to see what happens. That might be interesting. Theo? Oh, hold on. Nope, didn't come in. All right, cool. Well, I'm going to give this a shot. Let's see what happens. I'll give everybody a minute. There's 40 people. There's 27 that have 28 that have provided input. All right, we seem to have stabilized. There's only a couple more that haven't jumped in. So give it another 10 seconds. I'll do a timer. Look at that. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Terminate. All right. So it's pretty clear that there is some interest here in looking at this particular problem. And I think that is a very interesting point at this at the end of this, because this is basically where we're trying to go with this this session. I think what that means is that we'll circulate back with the chairs and others and see where we go from there. Bob.
Sean, the question you asked was, do people understand the problem? I think Stephen has also mentioned that.
Oh, I can't see the
chat. That's different from do we want to solve it? Okay. So maybe we should ask a second question.
Absolutely. That's why I love doing this stuff on the fly. My friends can tell me how to do it. Do you think we should work on this problem? And I know that this is going to be go from there. Stephen? Or Dennis, sorry.
I was just going to suggest, if you're asking the question, perhaps put some kind of implied time frame on it. Should we work on it as something for a year's time, or something where we need answers now?
Well, I mean, I think that, I I don't think like, hey, you guys go away for a year and come back and give us an answer is really appropriate. Like if people want it, it's a contribution driven organization, and if people want to get together in a room and knock it out, then like let them do that. Right. So I think it's like starting to work on the problem, and then people figure it out. I will tell you, I don't want this to consume all of the energy in the TLS working group, but we can do that via other mechanisms. And if there's a whole bunch of interest, if we've got 27 people from 15 different places that are really super excited about this and want to do it, we can spin up interims and the whole 9 yards to keep people that are really interested and focused on that working on it. Or if we fall down and decide that we don't want to do it, we can also end it. Dennis?
Yeah, so I was maybe a little confused. It's good to see that we kind of understand the problem. And for the record, I put yes to this to this poll. Moving from that to like, do we actively want to solve this problem?
Yep. Then it gets much more complicated because it's
where do we go next with this?
So
Like,
that's where I
assuming
think we have to just keep asking a little more questions, and then it's like, okay, well, what does this entail? And then we could say for TLS we can do this bit. For if there's another part of the ecosystem has to do this, you can like carve those off. I think there is a way to figure out what that might be.
we're still going to have a discussion about the solutions and their properties,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Before
Yeah. I mean,
anything else. Okay, thanks.
absolutely. This is just the problem. Like it's again, I look at this as a mini BOF. It's like, all right, now what are we going to do? Then we'll have proposals and like, does it solve the problem? And go from there. Mr. Patton.
Hey everybody. So I wanted to ask here, I wonder if we all have a common understanding of why the current ecosystem as it is doesn't solve this problem. So that might be a question to ask next. So I mean, it just something Dennis said that struck a chord with me was like, we have like the CAB forum, which is like it sort of seems to be the forum for solving this problem, like politically. I'm wondering, not knowing much about what CAB does myself, I'm just wondering.
I would argue that it's probably the discussions that I've heard today, it's some of the problem, but I definitely don't want this to turn into us shaking our fist at the CA browser forum saying like, hey, you guys, you should have fixed this thing. Like you're screwing up. So we're going over here. Like, I think that's just not a good way forward. But yeah, I get your point. Mr. Wood?
Just as a clarifying question, so I assume the order of operations here was first see if people understand the problem, which it does seem like people do understand the problem as proposed. Then, as Stephen was suggesting, or Bob was suggesting rather, go one step further and ask if we want to work on the problem. And then in the context of that, if the answer is yes, people would sort out like whatever the solution is. And the solution might be the ecosystem and the stuff that are in the ecosystem is good enough as is. Like no changes required. But if the answer is no, then like that's it. That's we end there. But that's my mental model. I just wanted to confirm that was indeed the what's happening here.
That lines up with my thinking as well.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew?
I wanted to respond a little bit to the CAB forum thing earlier. I think this is less about the CAB forum or whatever forum is used to set CAs going forward, as it's more about the historical decisions that have been made by various trust programs 5-10 years ago, and ensuring that we can continue to support those decisions that were made 5 or 10 years ago in the interest of not deprecating those clients and not having to abandon those users.
Thanks. Michael?
Based on what Christopher Patton said as well, and I kind of wrote it in the chat, what I think my summary from the explanations was that there are problems, and then I heard that there are technical solutions to some of these problems, and I think that's where the conflict is, because my impression is that maybe some of those technical solutions are impractical for reasons that are not well understood. So I think that maybe that's part of the question that's making difficult, do we need to solve this problem or not? Because I think some people don't quite understand or disagree whether or not the problem is in fact already solvable technically or politically. That makes sense? Probably not.
No, it does. I think that's a pretty good summary. Yeah. So all right, so I'm going to do the next question that I think Stephen kicked off and Bob amplified. So let me. Hopefully, I didn't put any. There's no spelling errors. Why can't I see the whole question? Oh well. Let's see what happens. Again, I'll give it a minute. There's 32 participants now. Look at that. We're getting pretty good rate of return here. All right, well, that's pretty good. That's approaching, I'll give it another 10 seconds here. And by the way, thank you for bearing with me while I learn how to press the buttons again. Ben, feel free to jump in.
Hey, Ben Schwartz. It struck me that the question says, should we work on this problem? I think that, the TLS working group has incredible technical expertise in it, and it is absolutely empowered to make the decisions about how the protocol works. But that's not really, I think, where the interesting questions here are. I think that we can absolutely build a thing that accomplishes the technical goal. And I think the really interesting questions here are about the organizations of trust, the systems of trust across the internet and across society. It's not really a question of like, did we put the TLS bytes in the right order? So I think somebody should work on this. But I'm not sure that we're at the stage of like, let's write down a standard and deploy it. And maybe the answer is like the Internet Architecture Board. Maybe the IAB actually should work on this.
David Adrian?
I just wanted to note that like adoption is not picking the solution. Like, I'm at Chrome and presume like we will experiment with things. Like that's how all of this goes. And I don't think anyone here is suggesting that we take any specific solution in any specific form, and that like the next steps of experimenting and understanding and what's going on is exactly like what this working group is going to do and what the people in working on TLS like have experience with and want to do. And so adopting the problem is not adopting solution, and understanding the impacts and experimenting is like the next steps. So I think we are doing what Ben is suggesting, or will be doing what Ben is suggesting. And if you look at what Chrome has done in the past with other variants, other extensions, changes to the TLS, new versions of the protocol, like this is something that TLS working group is particularly good at compared to other parts of the IETF, is actually experimenting, running code, seeing what happens, refining the solution, and all of that stuff. And so I'm very positive and bullish on our ability to do that and then find a good result.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I guess the only thing I would add, from a chair's perspective and maybe having been around a while, is that TLS does tend to lead a little bit here. And so I do, Ben, I do get your point about, there are bigger questions here. We're definitely not going to be able to solve it, but like, I sometimes wonder if we waited to the very end, if anything would ever happen. So I think if we start moving, things can get more interesting. So, all right. So I guess I'm going to open it now. Does there anybody think we should ask any other questions? That are related to this topic? Because if not, I'm going to say thank you very much for your time. And I thought this was very productive. We got some information out of here, and we'll regroup and figure out what that means. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to the scribes. Thank you very much, Chris, for being our go-between in the middle to get this started. And I do think we've actually moved the ball.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you, Chris Wood. Thank you, Dennis Jackson, and thank you to the presenters from the Chrome team. And thank you all for participating.
And we'll see you in a couple of weeks or so.
All right.
Thanks all. Hopefully we'll see you in Dublin.
Yeah, I think Tim's going to have to make sure he brings his drinking boots.